All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here on this nice Friday at 1 p.m. We've had a great start to our symposium this morning with a workshop from James and Isa from the Ella Baker Center. Really glad that you're here too for James's address, which is titled Understanding Prison Abolition in Practice, Reentry and Community. James is campaign manager for the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. And just personally super excited for his talk and our conversation together as well about the topic of prison abolition. Super important concept, but one that's often really, I think, misunderstood too, in terms of what it actually means in application. So James, thanks so much for sharing your insight with us today. Thank you.
Hey, can you all hear me okay? How about now? Oh, awesome. I'm going to give a few prepared remarks and then would love to open it up for discussion and questions or just like thoughts from everyone here. I'll start by saying I'm extremely honored to be invited to speak to you today at the Humanities Beyond Bars Symposium. In fact, I feel particularly privileged to be at this specific event because it was during the latter years of my incarceration that classes in philosophy and literature helped expand my thinking and situate my life and experiences within the broader context of the communities and institutions I've interacted with throughout my life. I realized that I didn't have to see myself as nothing more than my incarceration status, that I didn't have to cling to a version of black masculinity that formed in my culture as a toxic response to white supremacy, one that demanded that I view the world through the binary of predator and prey, but that I could instead think of myself as a student and a writer, as a friend and a positive force in my community. In a very real sense, studying the humanities helped me discover my own humanity while still incarcerated. I realized during that period of my life that prison and the underlying messages it conveyed about my worth, when blindly accepted, were fundamentally undermining my ability to be a fully functioning, interdependent community member who operates in love and kindness. The movement to dismantle the criminal legal system and defund the prison industrial complex is once again at a pivotal moment. As I write this, my heart is heavy because of the extreme violence that recently occurred in Sacramento. 6 people were killed, almost a dozen others were wounded, and many others were exposed to the overwhelming trauma of gun violence. I've either experienced or committed violence throughout each of the 5 decades of my life, so I'm achingly familiar with the pain, the fear, the feelings of isolation, shame, and unworthiness that perpetuate and result from these devastating acts. I know what it feels like to see someone shot and wonder, why not me? Or to wrestle with the randomness when indiscriminate terror bursts into your life. For me and perhaps others, the violence of this particular act hits close to home in ways that bombs dropping in Ukraine and other parts of the world do not. While I can abstractly empathize with people who are forced to endure the violence of war, I've never personally experienced it. Besides, I've been taught to distinguish between acts of war, crimes, and even state-sanctioned violence in the name of public safety as so entirely different that they seemingly cannot be cut from the same cloth. While I can now recognize the rhetorical tricks and tortured carceral logic at play when we make those distinctions, none of it comes close to healing the harm we all experience when we are forced to accept violence as a way of life. On a side note, when I speak of state-sanctioned violence, I'm referring to arrest at gunpoint, the coercive aspects of being tried, and forced captivity. Whether a person believes state violence is justified or has value, it is still a form of violence, one that is largely invisible to people whose property, privilege, or safety is seemingly protected by it. Each time I see one of these shootings, I'm struck by the ways violence begins to compile upon violence. Each time I'm disturbed by how normal it all is, how the media and various actors begin their own ritualized forms of violence that are typically less acute, yet support the conditions and belief systems that normalize violence in the first place. To be more specific, I'm talking about politicians who attempt to exploit the emotions of the aftermath of the violence to make the case for more state-sanctioned violence as the answer, and the willingness of the media to be exploited in the names of increasing their readership and revenue. I recently read a few media stories that detailed the criminal history of one of the people accused of the shooting in Sacramento. He's been in and out of prison since he was 18 years old. In 2018, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was actually released about 4 years later. The district attorney, who coincidentally is running for higher office, saw this coming and vigorously opposed this person's release. But he was released anyway. Then this happened. Why'd they let him out? On and on this narrative goes. It's compelling to the majority of people, perhaps because we have been hearing different versions of it from politicians and the media for eons. Left out is any type of critique of the response by the state to acts of violence the person in question has been accused of in the past. As I mentioned earlier, this person was thrown in prison at age 18. The media doesn't report anything about his life prior to his first arrest. It's almost as if he did not exist until the very moment he began going through the criminal legal system. A person telling this story decided that nothing about this individual's life was relevant beyond their conviction history. Oh, there was one other detail. A picture of a young black man, unsmiling, taking what appeared to be a mugshot. So we know his gender, race, and conviction history. Theoretically, I know that no one is born a criminal, committing acts of violence. Instead, what we deem criminal acts spring from an inability of the person in question to respond to trauma in their own lives in healthy ways that avoid perpetuating the violence they experience. I hate that we as a society are so desensitized to the factors that would bring a person into the prison industrial complex at such a young age, but instead seem to take it as something that inevitably happens for some. It reminds me, when I was growing up, going to jail was considered a rite of passage that signaled my transition from black child to young black male. Or as Ice Cube said about county jail way back in 1990s, piece of cake, it was just like a party, because in the county, you know everybody. I also really dislike that the storyteller has so much sway in what is reported. I believe it's an extension of state-sanctioned violence when journalists only get their details from law enforcement. I cannot begin to describe the impact generations of images in newspapers or on the news have had upon all of us when it comes to internalizing anti-black biases. In addition to the normalization of incarcerating black children, in this instance, we're also asked to ignore that this person went to prison multiple times and by the media's account became increasingly violent and disconnected from society as a result. That's because violence is not an effective remedy for ending violence. In fact, many of the factors that contribute to violent behavior, like the inability to process trauma, feelings of shame, low self-worth, a lack of empathy and respect for the value of life, are exacerbated by the violence of incarceration. Moreover, the person in question spent close to 7 years incarcerated between jail and prison on a 10-year sentence. Even in the politician's own logic, it's unclear how an additional few years of captivity would change the factors that led to this act he's accused of. Instead, this logic sees the person in question as fundamentally irredeemable, unworthy of larger society ever. I'd remind each of us, these are forms of violence that are being perpetuated prior to any final determination of what happened. Of course, this violence I'm describing isn't as acute as the mass shooting. It will probably only traumatize his family members and loved ones. But I'd argue it is a central aspect of our current system for criminalization that drives over-incarceration and extreme sentencing. For all the shortcomings of this tough-on-crime sensationalized rhetoric, however, I tend to think that abolitionist rhetoric is similarly insufficient. As you all know, this language springs from the movement in the 19th century to abolish slavery. Many parts of it work well for the current movement. For instance, abolition highlights the racism of the current legal system, makes the case that incarceration is the direct descendant of slavery in this country. And actually, though, incarceration has several important differences with slavery. One chief one being that people were largely born into slavery, whereas to be incarcerated in this country, there are a series of rituals one has to go through, like arrest, trial, conviction. So when comparing slavery to incarceration, some see the similarities, others focus on the differences. And because this is an imperfect metaphor, I believe people respond to it according to their pre-held biases. Like all language, however, this metaphor is also reductive. The issues that the abolitionist framework attempt to address go far beyond our legal systems and the prison industrial complex. This nation's series of rituals that result in criminalization and incarceration are a product of a series of institutions and structures that commodify and objectify everyone. Policing and incarceration in this nation are tools for ensuring capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy operate effectively. And since abolitionist rhetoric highlights what are essentially subsystems of a much larger network of systems and structures that formalize oppression, disenfranchisement, and what Ruth Wilson Gilmore has termed the organized abandonment of whole swaths of people in this country, it then falls short of describing the entirety of what is needed to create a society that nurtures, shares resources, uplifts, and creates a sense of belonging for any and all people. You may disagree with this, but I believe that when people are feeling the pain of what happened in Sacramento, an abolitionist response does not resonate for people in pain the same ways that tough on crime rhetoric, with its implications of retribution and co-opting of the notion of justice, does. At the same time, if pressed, I would respond to questions the same way any good abolitionist would. I'd point out that before the shooting, our society failed the individuals involved completely. When those people acted out earlier in response to trauma in their own lives, they were criminalized and taken into captivity. Instead, they should have had access to trauma support as children, access to mental health resources, affordable housing, education, a pathway to a standard of living that met their material needs, and by providing those resources early, we could prevent violence later. To take it even a step further, I believe the community-based resources that some of us are receiving upon our release from prison can actually serve as the template for resources needed to actually practice an abolitionist community. Today, there are many great organizations supporting reentry for people leaving prison. In my case, I'd been offered a job with a living wage just prior to my release. I was picked up at the gate, given new clothes, taken out for breakfast. I went to a transitional house where I lived with only 2 other people. I had my own room, my own shower and food, no curfew. Friends and community members donated a laptop, a cell phone, and other items to me. I even had a small amount of savings from writings I published while incarcerated. And upon reentry, each of my material needs were met, and I was supported, affirmed, and held in community by people who knew I'd been in prison and didn't think less of me because of it. Going back even further, while in prison, I'd been mentored by other incarcerated people, many of whom are still in captivity, who taught me how to end the cycle of being traumatized and perpetuating trauma I'd been caught up in my entire life. Incarcerated men taught me to walk it off, journal, weigh the pros and cons of my actions, and accept the consequences. From incarcerated women, I learned that the oppression one experiences being a black man in this country does not exempt you from inflicting similar harms on others. They taught me to see the interconnectedness of all of our campaigns to end institutionalized oppression in our communities. Let me say explicitly, I'm not trying to make a case for rehabilitation. It's an aspect of privilege to ignore the violence of poverty, the failures of society to provide basic support and resource for marginalized neighborhoods, to disenfranchise people who are often still teenagers, and then say that that person alone needs to be rehabilitated. The children from low-income neighborhoods are not inherently bad, so if they disproportionately cause harm later in their lives, it's essential we look to which systems are failing them. I believe that resources are forming to support loved ones who are being released from prison, and that it gives us a fresh way of providing concrete answers about what an abolitionist society could look like. Organizations like Project Rebound, Dave Cowan's Bonafide, or the Ahimsa Collective give us tangible, practical answers about the ways we can create healing in our communities that will eventually reduce violence in our neighborhoods. In addition, the #1 reentry provider are the families of people being released. Offering them support and resources does not happen nearly enough. Few things these community-based resources share are a respect for people's dignity and agency. They have a compassion when people make mistakes and a humility to avoid centering their knowledge of reentry above an individual's experience. Each person successfully reentering society from prison needs similar things: an internalized new identity that increases their feelings of self-worth and community, the tools to process trauma in ways that don't cause harm to themselves or others, and opportunities and resources to have a standard of life that feels dignifying. These are the same things all community members need, regardless of any criminalization or incarceration. When we accept the value of all life by investing in each life, we make moments like what happened in Sacramento last week virtually impossible. I don't care who you are. If your family and your neighborhood helped you feel safe and empowered as a child, you won't turn to a gun for those feelings later. When you are taught that you matter, your happiness matters, your security matters, love matters, you will see that others matters too. There's a way of contributing to people's feelings of self-worth that lead them to see the worth of others. I learned that from people who are incarcerated, individuals the government has said never deserve to see the light of day. I've been nurtured by people who are being kept from their own families at gunpoint. So I know that any belief system that sees people as disposable is not only missing the mark, it's actively causing harm. As a society, I sincerely hope we do not let the fears that are being exploited by some for personal gain deter us from openly and honestly critiquing state-sanctioned violence in our nation. Just as committing acts of violence towards children in the name of discipline normalizes violence for them, responding to individual acts of violence in our communities with arrest and captivity normalizes and reinforces the violence we are all trying to see end. I believe it's time we add to the language of what we want to abolish, dismantle, and defund. We already have several examples of the world we want to build. Philosophies like "we keep us safe," "care not cages," and all they apply about the community's role in creating alternatives to policing and incarceration give us a roadmap for creating safer communities that do not rely upon punishment and retribution. Thank you. As I mentioned,
Thank you, James. I just wanted to note that we do have plenty of time for questions and discussion, at least 20, 25 minutes. So I just wanted to invite you to raise your hands and feel free to ask questions of James. That actually reminds me, one other thing that I'll also ask is when you have a question, this is a good opportunity to be thinking of questions right now as I'm still talking. I'm going to give you a microphone to speak into because we're live streaming this and we're recording it. And so if you don't speak into a mic, we won't be able to capture your great question.
So before, we were kind of talking about specific strategies to use in the video that was showed. And I think kind of from like a social work perspective or like nonprofit organizations who work with probation and parole, who have clients who are still incarcerated right now. I'm just wondering, as far as like our assessments go, our intakes, like what specific tools, how did you get the dialogue started other than saying, okay, tell me your story?
Thank you for that question. I think the organizations that feel most effective are very circumspect in how they partner with law enforcement agencies like probation and parole, and very cognizant of the differing agendas. So and I'll give an example. There are transitional houses that if you get in trouble with your parole officer, they'll kick you out. Not being cognizant that by being complicit in reinforcing the legal system in this particular instance, they're perhaps contributing to creating a worse dynamic. So that's a roundabout way of saying that the questions that feel most important to center when nonprofits are looking at how to support people who are coming back home are first and foremost, what are they asking for? Secondly, what are the gaps that the organization itself has in understanding what's being asked? And what often happens in a nonprofit space is you have a lot of people who might come from a certain background that's not indicative of the background of the people that they're working to serve. So the nonprofit it's helpful to interrogate themselves. Make sure that they have pathways to have a framework or a way of looking at it that's really inclusive of the people's experience they're trying to help. From there, the questions are, how can we center this person's experience? How can we center their agency? How can we accommodate for just how individual an experience re-entering society is? I've personally been released from prison twice, and each time was vastly different than the first time in my own emotional journey. And so recognizing that every person's pathway home and pathway to reintegrating into society is vastly different, and how can systems be put in place that are supportive of that truth and not restrictive of it. The final thing that I would say is a clear understanding that all systems are imperfect and will not meet the needs of the people that you are trying to help. And so it's important to have a willingness to go outside of the lines when necessary to provide personal support for people.
Thank you.
Hey, how you doing again, right? So a lot of your testimonials, they referenced or paralleled famous sociologist Robert K. Merton's social strain theory, where society puts a lot of pressure on individuals to accept socially accepted goals, but don't give them the resources to obtain it, so they result to deviance. So this deviance in America is pretty much very bad. That's why we're here, right? So do you think it's a national threat or a national, do you think it deserves national attention?
I think what deserves a national discussion and critique are the ways these institutions and this way of responding to harm that happens in our society is impacting all of the stakeholders. I mentioned earlier during our workshop that everyone's impacted by the criminal legal system. It's either upholding your material wealth, your privilege, your whatever you're bringing, or it's excluding you. It's actively excluding you and setting a set of social norms and acting as enforcement for a set of social norms that are not working for the vast majority of people in this country. So, but I think that conversation has to be situated within the actual harm that is happening. We as a society have been fed some things that actually make harm more likely, whether it's criminalized or not. These notions of individual ruggedness, pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps, of you go out and get it, survival of the fittest, that inform all of us, or were like part of all of our ethos growing up, has blinded us to the collectiveness of our collectiveness, our interdependence, our need for one another, the fact that there's no me without you. I am a product of the people who have been in my life, the experiences I've had, the context. And our legal system is built upon a false binary or false theory of individual actions and a moral framework of good and bad that is also really harming a constructive dialogue. This notion that a person acts out of pain in a way that harms someone else and they're therefore bad, that's not helpful. It's not like, and we've built an entire system off of this notion of good people and bad people, good acts and bad acts. So it's imperative we backtrack, get away even from our moralistic leanings and our emphasis on individuality, and start to see things as from a collective standpoint and a more amoral standpoint. No.
I think there we
Yes.
go. Okay. So you spoke really powerfully about how, actually kind of what you were just talking about, but this notion that justice requires some kind of retribution or punishment really just feeds this cycle of violence. And I'm wondering what your view of an abolitionist justice looks like and how it differs.
Thank you. It's a great question. I to be transparent, I struggle with a couple of things within that. One is justice itself is a religious term, and I'm comfortable in my faith. I'm not aspiritual or any of those things. However, I don't think that it's helpful to build society off of notions like justice, because it sets an ideal that is, first and foremost, in a nation of 350 million people, defined 350 million different ways. Like, everyone in this room has different notions of what justice is. It sets an expectation that there is a just response, which means that there is an objectively a just response to whatever just happened. And we're subjective. So even if that were true, how would we ever know it? We have no way of identifying objectivity. So just this idea of getting to a just response, I struggle with. And especially the fact that there are systems that we would be able to create systems that could get us there. I do think that a lot of times what we mean by just is accountability, restoration, a commitment that no further harm is done. And those are responses I think we can get to, but I think that a lot of the rhetoric that we've all ascribed so much to is limiting us and limiting our ability to really think constructively about it. Yeah, I guess that's where I would close.
Hello, my name is Lorenzo Tafoya, and I'm an outreach counselor here at Bakersfield, at Cal State Bakersfield, and I deal a lot with the youth. I do outreach with middle schoolers and high schoolers, and my question is what advice would you give to a student that comes from this impoverished areas, marginalized communities that sometimes feels impossible to get out of the system. So how can they mobilize and maybe create some space for them to really make an impact and get out of that system?
Thank you. I think the first thing that I would feel is important to me is to affirm that the emotions that being in that situation are producing for them are valid. Like, whether it be anger, outrage, a fear, anxiety, whatever living in that situation is bringing into their lives, that it's valid, and that it's important that older people in their lives are supportive as they figure it out. The second thing that question raises for me is, and I'll use myself as an example, growing up with what I consider to be bad parenting, going through trauma and pain in my household first, then stepping outside, acting out, and having that punished, going to school and having my actions punished, really helped me internalize this notion of that punishment can and should be a way of life, that there's no notion of fairness that doesn't include punishment when someone is harmed or when harm occurs. But it also produced for me simultaneously a hostility towards authority figures that I now look back on and say, well, why would I trust a teacher who punished me for breaking a pencil? Why would I trust these authority figures? And so I think prior to any advice, it's important to realize that we as older individuals, our age and our whatever privileges we bring to that relationship, whatever power we bring to that relationship, then should not be conflated with the right to give advice. Like, the first and foremost question for me is, how can I earn your trust? What advice do you have for me in this relationship so that we can have a healthy relationship? And then I think that the advice that if you continue to try, if you continue to believe in yourself, hold yourself, and believe in your own self-worth, you will eventually get to a better place, I think is important as well. Yeah.
Hi, how are you? My name is Roberto Luca, and I am with a Reentry organization in Torrance, California. I'm a director there, and I'm also formerly incarcerated. My question to you is that, you know, there's a lot of movement, in a sense, going on in Los Angeles when it comes to reentry, a lot of funding, a lot of programs. The majority of it is connected to workforce and development.
Mm-hmm.
Where I seen the gap was in empowering individuals. And what I mean by that is, like, when individuals are coming home to us, when they're coming to our transitional housing, when they're coming to our community center, there's a very self of autonomy, very low sense of that, very low sense of self-esteem, and you know, on and on. So what we try to do is support him in building that.
Right.
So I guess my question to you is like, what would you advise as like what maybe you have seen as being like the best practices? Like, I already know what we're doing, and like I have my own answer, but I want to learn from you.
Thank you. I think the one of the first things to acknowledge is, in that relationship, that transitional houses and reentry providers need the people coming home from prison just as much as the people coming home from prison need those resources. It's a mutual and reciprocal relationship. And I think being clear-eyed about that and acknowledging that to people is important. Like, because they know, like, there's a contract in play here. Someone's being paid to do this for me. And so acknowledging that and being transparent about it is extremely important. And then the final thing is, or the second thing is, make sure you're always giving people choices and communicating to them that you will not be punished because of your choices. I'll give an example. Like, you can tell a person, we can either help you set up your own checking account, or you can hold on to your money if that feels better. Regardless of whatever they choose, if they're frivolous with their money or if they make poor financial decisions, especially early on, the response can't be punitive, but instead, how can we work with you to budget better, and how can we support you? By giving people choices, or naming their choices rather, supporting them in whatever they choose, and giving them the resources to follow through on that choice, and support if they fail in that choice, or if a mistake is made or it doesn't turn out the way they plan, will increase their autonomy and agency quite the same way it did for us, right? I think it's just imperative that people know that if they don't get it right the first time, so what? There's a second and a third, and as many times as you need.
Hello, my name is Aaron Chung. I'm also formerly incarcerated, and I currently work at the Project Rebound for Cal State LA. My question to you is, like, you know, when you got out, especially for reentry, because I deal with like a lot of struggles myself, how did you deal with, you know, the suspicion that you had towards, you know, people who you didn't know and people who you knew? But at the same time, how did you deal with the kindness that people showed you? Because for me, you know, experiencing kindness on the, you know, when you get out is a weird thing, because, you know, when you're in prison, kindness is a double-edged sword in prison, because they will ask you to do something that you might not want to do.
Yeah.
So how did you, as an individual, deal with, you know, dealing with the suspicion, people being kind to you, people treating you like a person, you know? Because for me, I look at the suspicion like, what do you want from me? You kind of feel what I mean? And I think, you know, people who are formerly incarcerated also struggle with that. But yeah, I just want to know, like, how you dealt with that.
Oh, thank you. So I was released a few months before the pandemic. And I remember I got out in December of 2019. And I remember March of 2020, the pandemic hit. I began working remotely. And beyond that, not much changed in my life. Like, people all around me, some people were losing their jobs, people were having different issues and struggles, experiencing a lot of hardship. I actually wasn't, because I'd just gotten out of prison, so I was experiencing greater freedom even in the beginning of the pandemic than I'd experienced before. So I was having a different experience than everyone. And then, for the first time in my life, I wasn't on the impacted side. Like, that was, and so during that period of time, I won't say that I responded to it well. Like, I responded by kind of like working harder and trying to show my worth even more, even though I knew that that was an aspect of survivor's remorse, survivor's guilt. I think that a friend of mine, Ken Hartman, gave remarks one time, and he said, you know, before I went to prison, everybody was a jerk. And when I got out, everybody was nice. And he said he realized it wasn't them that had changed, it was him. Like when he was a jerk, he saw everyone as a jerk. And when he was nice and kind, he saw more niceness and kindness in other people. So I'd encourage you to first and foremost understand how the way you're showing up is contributing to that response that you're getting. And then secondly, though it may be difficult, use it as an opportunity to affirm your worth. Regardless of why they're being kind, you deserve kindness. Regardless of what their agenda is, these are the ways you deserve to be treated in this society. And it's not always easy to accept because of what we've internalized prior to that, but that's the work, to learn to accept dignity, respect, kindness, and celebrate it when it comes your way. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Time for maybe one more question, if there is time, and if there is another question. Great. Mandy, you can close this out.
Thank you. And I'm going to say Isa was right. That was a beautiful and powerful speech, and so many layers to it. I didn't absorb it all because my mind went off on different tangents while you were speaking. I love the thought of the social responsibility that we have, that we are maybe failing. I'm interested in how you answer people who say, no, it's personal responsibility. I've had struggles. I didn't do what the man in Sacramento did, and you're letting him off the hook by saying it's the social responsibility. How would you answer that?
I would start by saying that those two notions are not mutually exclusive. There is a personal responsibility that we all have for our actions that should not be discounted. Like, any person that shoots another person should be accountable, and there should be consequences. I wouldn't say that those consequences should be submitting oneself to further violence, but there should be some consequence for that, and there should be a means and mechanism to help that person exist in a world that does not, where they don't feel like that's a proper solution for any type of thing that they're going through. So I think that it's okay to acknowledge the personal responsibility of people who commit acts of harm. And I think that it's essential for a healthy community and interpersonal relationships, right? If even I and I can list a litany of ways that I've been marginalized through my life, then I go harm a friend, I go harm Issa and say, yep, young black male, like don't blame me, blame society. Our relationship won't be healthy and it won't survive. So I think it's okay, and it's an essential component of healthy relationships for personal responsibility to exist. I think we have to critique what the consequences that we put upon people are in the name of personal responsibility. And I think that none of the personal responsibility or individual agency within that distracts from society's responsibility to acknowledge that organized abandonment is a very real issue in our nation, that there is a severe inequity that is producing a disproportionate amount of violence and harm in certain neighborhoods, and that we collectively will be better off if we address that. And I'm not talking about it in a way where a person sits in their suburban home and becomes dismayed by violence in the Tenderloin and fearful as if that violence could ever reach them, and then votes for tough on crime or votes for whatever based upon their own fear. But I'm talking about approaching this in a way where we do not put our fears and above others' lived experience and above what people are going through who are dealing with this lack of a social network and this lack of a social net, in their lives.
Thank you, James. Once again, everybody, please give me James a round of applause. And thanks everybody again for being here and for your questions. I just want to note too, we have a break now till 2:30 p.m., but the symposium's not over, so please do hang out. 2:30 p.m., where you have a workshop from Quan Nguyen and Darlene Luca of Defy Ventures, titled Unlocking Purpose and Freedom Through Entrepreneurship. That's going to be a very interactive, discussion-based workshop, energizing for all of us, which is needed on a Friday afternoon, I know. And also Quan has copies of his book, his autobiography, which I've read and I can vouch for. It's just an excellent read, including touching on some of the themes that James talked about today, in terms of his background, his life, experiences leading to incarceration, and also just overcoming lots of barriers and challenges in life in really fascinating, impactful ways. So Quan's going to be in the back to sign those books for you if you're interested. That book is called Sparrow and the Razor Wire, Finding Freedom from Within While Serving a Life Sentence. And Quan also donates money to several important causes based on every book that is purchased that are supporting currently and formerly incarcerated persons. So please do visit him back there. And we'll see you at 2:30 p.m. Thanks.